Welcome everyone to our Canadian Diabetes Association's National Fall Webinar Series. My name is Farah Ismail and I'm a Program Manager for the Canadian Diabetes Association, and I'll be your host for today. We are delighted that you're able to join us for the webinar to learn all about carbohydrate counting. Now, to start off, I would like to draw your attention to the survey at the top right-hand section of your screen. So in order for CDA to better serve your needs, we kindly ask that you provide us with your input by completing the short survey towards the end of the presentation. And we thank you in advance for your input. Now, throughout the presentation, you will have the opportunity to type in a question and answer box, which is located at the bottom right-hand section of your screen. And so we ask you use this box for any questions that you have, and our presenter, Megan, will be happy to answer the questions at the end of the presentation. Throughout the presentation, we will be displaying a few polling questions, and we would love for your participation in the questions. I just wanted to remind you folks that all the answers are definitely anonymous, so we do hope you will participate. Also note that you're able to customize your screens. You can expand and collapse them as you please, and that's done easily by dragging the bottom right-hand section of each of the webinar pods. Now, the presentation itself will last 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll do about a 10 to 15-minute question and answer period at the end. Now, it's important to remember that the presentation itself is recorded, and we will have it available on our Canadian Diabetes Association website, as well as our CDA YouTube channel. So now I'd like to welcome our speaker, Megan. She's actually just jumped on board today. Our original speaker, Joanne Lewis from CDA, was unfortunately unable to attend, but I would like to give you a bit of background on Megan, and she's actually quite the perfect fit for today's webinar. Megan completed her nutrition degree at Ryerson University, and she did her practical dietetic training at St. Mike's Hospital. Now, she's currently also working in the diabetes clinic at St. Mike's, where she sees patients for both type 1 and type 2 diabetes who are taking insulin. She also teaches a class on carbohydrate counting for patients at St. Mike's, hence why she's the perfect fit. So for more information on Megan, please read the speaker bio section on the left of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to present to you Megan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Farah, for the introduction. As Farah mentioned, I work at St. Michael's Hospital in the Diabetes Clinic. I'm a registered dietitian, and I do teach a carbohydrate counting class to patients here at St. Mike's. But I am new to webinars, and this is just starting out on these slides today, so please bear with me. And if you have any questions or there's any technical issues, please put them in the Q&A, and Farah will be able to answer those. So again, I'm Megan, and I'm happy to be here with everyone today, so let's get started. All right, so today in the session, we're going to learn about what is a carbohydrate, why should we count carbohydrates. We're going to look at how to identify foods that do and do not contain carbs. We're going to learn how to read labels, we're going to talk about measuring foods, and we're going to actually do some examples where we're counting carbs. Finally, I'll talk about a few resources for finding carbohydrate content of foods. So what is a carbohydrate? Certainly that's an important question, and our food is made up of three main nutrients. So that's our protein, fat, and carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are the main nutrients found in food that affect our blood sugar. Points of interest, carbohydrates are 4 calories for every gram. And our body, when we eat carbohydrates, breaks it down into glucose or sugar. And I'll use those words interchangeably, as I'll also use carb and carbohydrate interchangeably. When our body breaks down our carbohydrates into glucose or sugar, it's that glucose that our body uses as one of our main sources of energy. So carbohydrates affect our blood sugar, but it's both the amount and the type of carbohydrate that determines our blood sugars after eating. And we also call this the postprandial glucose levels or post-meal glucose levels. So we can use carbohydrate counting to keep track of what carbs we're eating and help us to better control our blood sugars. So why count carbs? So like I said, it can help us keep our control our blood sugars. And And the better our blood sugar control is, the better we're going to feel. Those highs and lows certainly can be frustrating and make you feel off. So the better control we can have, the better. Carbohydrate counting also provides flexibility. So it allows us to include all foods. No foods are off limit because we're going to learn how to count them. And so if you count them, when it comes to your blood sugars, you can eat them. And certainly we'll explore that more. It's also a good approach to meal planning. So when we're thinking about our blood sugar control, if we can focus in on the carbohydrates and using that to plan our meals, then that's going to help with our diabetes management. So which foods have carbs? So there's a bunch of foods up here, so I'll give everybody a few minutes to take a look and see if you can identify which foods contain carbohydrates. And I'll give one hint and say that the salad contains no croutons. All right, so now I'll give everyone the answer. All right, so you can see here the foods that do contain carbs and the foods that don't. So namely the ones that do are our starchy foods, our sugary foods, our fruits and our sweet vegetables like the corn, and then our milk. And then the foods that contain little or no carbohydrates and don't directly affect our blood sugars are most of our vegetables, our proteins like meats and alternatives, things like tofu, and then also our fats. All right. So during the presentation, I'm going to talk about carb choices and sort of interchangeably with carb grams and choices. And that's because we have what's called the choice system. So you can see here we have our 4 categories of foods that contain carbohydrates: our grains and starches, fruits, sweet vegetables, milk and alternatives, and our others, or our sweet foods. So each of these items here, the serving size that you see is contains 15 grams of carbohydrate, or is one choice. So to our body, each of these serving sizes means the same thing. It means sugar, because we turn it into sugar. And so 15 grams of carbohydrate is about the same as 3 teaspoons of sugar. So by using the choice system, it's a good way of sort of estimating our carbs. So we can talk about choices, or we can talk about grams of carbohydrates. So does the type of carbohydrate matter? Sorry, I mentioned at the start that it's both the amount and the type of carbohydrates that play a role. So all carbohydrates, except for fiber, get turned into sugar eventually. But some foods turn into sugar faster than the others. So we have something called the Glycemic Index, and this talks about how quickly something turns into sugar. So something with a low glycemic index is going to turn into sugar more slowly. So after 2 hours eating something with low glycemic index, there's only going to be a little bit of sugar that's in our blood. Something with a high glycemic index is going to turn into sugar really quickly, and after 2 hours, there's going to be a big spike in our blood sugar. So certainly this is going to impact our post-meal blood sugar. But in the end, it really is the amount of carbohydrate that is most important, and that's why we're talking about the carb counting today. So when it comes to carb counting, there are 2 levels of carb counting. There's the basic carbohydrate counting, and this will allow us to achieve and maintain a consistency in how much carbohydrate we intake at each meal and at our snacks at similar times a day each day. So, for example, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we can eat different amount of carbs, but every day we want our breakfast to be the same as the next day and the next day, and our lunch to be the same. And this is what we talk about, the consistency. So it's not that we have to have the same amount of carbs at all meals in one day, but each meal on a given day we want to keep it the same. And so this basic carbohydrate counting is appropriate for individuals with all types of diabetes, regardless of you're on an oral agent or a basal insulin or a basal and bolus insulin. And it's especially important when we're talking about weight reduction or weight maintenance because we're controlling the amount of carbs. So the second type of carb counting is advanced carb counting. And this is for patients who are using a basal bolus insulin regimen. So they take the long-acting insulin as well as the fast-acting or mealtime or bolus insulin. And the advanced carb counting is what's going to provide the greatest flexibility. Because if you can count your carbs, you can vary your insulin intake at your meal based on the amount of carbs. So we're going to start first by talking about the basic carb counting. And generally it's for individuals who either don't use insulin or who use a once or twice daily insulin, so perhaps a basal insulin. And this can help because we want to keep the carbohydrates consistent at the same type of day. And so we want to set goals or carb goals for our meals and our snacks. So I pulled up the sort of a piece of this handout earlier that's from the CDA. It's called Beyond the Basics. And this is a great guide when you're trying to carb count. On the left, again, we have the foods that contain carbohydrates. And each serving size there contains 15 grams of carbohydrates or is one choice. On the right side, we have those foods that contain little or no carbs and aren't going to affect our blood sugar. So our vegetables, our meats and alternatives, and our fats. And this can allow us to build our meals and help with basic carb counting. So let's look a little bit more into where the carbohydrates are found. So we mentioned that there's 4 groups here. The first one being the grains and starches, the fruits and sweet vegetables, milk, and then the others are the sugars. And so as I mentioned, within each of these categories, we've got different items and different serving sizes for each item, but each item seen there and each serving size seen there is 15 grams of carbs. So for example, in the grains and starches, 1 slice of bread or a third of a cup of cooked rice or half a cup of cooked pasta are all going to be one choice or 15 grams of carbohydrates. When it comes to the fruits, 1 apple or half a banana or 2 cups of strawberries, those are all going to be one choice. So certainly if we're looking at the strawberries, we're getting a little bit more bang for our buck there because we're going to have 2 full cups of strawberries. When it comes to milks, it's going to be 1 cup of milk or a third of a cup of plain yogurt is going to be 15 grams of carbohydrates or one choice. And then the other, we've got things like a tablespoon of regular jam or 3 little cookies. So essentially, these is sort of an exchange system because of the bread equals the serving of the pasta equals the potato, equals the fruit, equals the milk. So we can exchange these at our meals and still know we're getting our 15 grams of carbohydrates. And then we also have the foods that contain little or no carbohydrates, and these are our vegetables, meats and alternatives, and fats. And so these are the foods that we want to make up the rest of our meal because we know that these are going to have very little impact on our blood sugars. So most of our vegetables are considered free and you can sort of eat as many as you want without having an effect on your blood sugars. But there are a few vegetables that are not considered free, and these are what I call the sweet vegetables. And so for a few of these, like squash and carrots and parsnips and peas, 1 cup of each of them is going to be 15 grams of carbohydrates, or is going to be one of our one choices. So I often see patients who, when I ask them how they carb count, they say they sort of guesstimate their carbs. And where they may get it right, maybe most of the time, maybe some of the time, what I do see is when people are sort of guesstimating or carb guessing, there's lots of fluctuations in their blood sugars. It's going to be high, it's going to be low, because if you don't get it sort of right on, you might be getting a little bit too much carbs or a little bit too little. So really for the best accuracy and for getting the best tight control, we do want to be carb counting. And for that, we want to be measuring using measuring cups and scales, and we want to be using all of our tools possible to figure out how much carbs is in each of our foods. So these might be websites or apps, which we'll talk a bit about more later, or the best thing is a food label. So let's take a look at reading a label. Oh, sorry, one point to consider when you're reading labels is that, and I think I mentioned this before, but fiber doesn't actually get turned into sugar, so it doesn't affect our blood sugar. So we actually have to subtract the fiber from the total carbohydrates, which we'll definitely take a look at and do an example. So here's an example of a nutrition facts label that you may see on the back of your food, like cereal boxes, pasta boxes, rice, things like that. So the first thing we want to look at is the serving size, because we need to keep in mind that all of the numbers that we see on this label relate to the serving size listed. So in this case, it's 1 cup, but if we were going to have a cup and a half or 2 cups or less, like half a cup, then we'd have to do a little bit of math to figure out exactly how many carbs. So for example, if we were going to have half a cup, we'd have to divide all the numbers by 2. So the next thing we want to look at is the total carbohydrate, and this category on the label includes starches, fibers, sugar, and then sugar alcohols if the food contains those. And these all make up our total carbohydrate. But as we mentioned, the dietary fiber doesn't actually affect our blood sugar, so we actually have to subtract the fiber, and that will give us our available carbohydrate, or net carbohydrate, or the carbohydrate that turns into sugar and affects our blood sugar. So in this example, the fiber is 0, so we wouldn't actually have to do too much math. We just take the total carbohydrate, subtract 0, and we'd be left with 31. So that would be the net carbohydrate, or the available carbohydrate in this example. And if you did see sugar alcohols, you'd do the same. You'd subtract it off. They're not very common in foods. All right, so let's practice. So I'll leave this up for a bit. And in this example, we're having half a cup of this food. So how many grams of carbohydrate would you be getting? So we are really looking here at the serving size. So I'm going to leave this up for maybe 30 seconds, and then I'll switch it over and I'll get everyone to put in their answer, and we'll see what people are thinking. All right, so I'll invite everybody to put in your answer, and I'll give everybody 10 seconds to do that, and then we will get the results. Right. So great, 91% got it right. It was 15.5. So if you didn't get the answer, you might have wanted to look at the serving size. So the portion there was 1 cup, but we were having half a cup, so we needed to divide the 31 grams by 2. All right, so this example, the next one, is another interactive example, and it's going to be a little bit trickier because we've got to look at both the serving size and the fiber. So in this example, the nutrition facts label is for half a cup. We've got the total fiber, we've got the total carbohydrates on our nutrition facts label, and then the example says, if you're having 1 cup of this food, how many grams of available carbohydrate would you be getting? So I'll give everyone a few minutes to take a look at this. Right. And so I'll get everyone to lock in their answer, and I'll give everyone 10 seconds to do that. And great, 80% got it right. So it was 20 grams. So the important thing there, what I find is useful is what I do is figure out the total available carbohydrates for the amount on the package, and then I do the math, in this case multiplying by 2 to get it for what I'm actually eating. All right, so another source of information for figuring out where the carbohydrates or how much carbohydrates there are in food is to use websites. So for example, if you're eating out, it's often difficult to figure out the carbohydrates, but thankfully there are some restaurants who do have the carbohydrate, all nutrition information available either on their website or the server may be able to give you a menu that they have actually in the restaurant. So I'm not sure how well you can see this. It's kind of written small, but in this example, we're having the mango chili shrimp, and we do have the nutrition information. So we have the total carbohydrates is 42 grams. The fiber is 2 grams, so we just have to do the math, and we'd have 40 grams of available carbohydrates that we're having in our meal. So one thing to keep in mind, and being a dietitian, I always have to plug healthy eating, but healthy eating is still important. So certainly, if we can count the carbs, then we can eat them, and we can get very good at counting carbs. But there are other things we want to keep in mind. We want to make sure we're having a well-balanced diet, getting lots of fruits and vegetables and milk, grains, whole grains, and make sure we're using fats in only a small amount. We want to make sure that we're not focusing just on the carbohydrates. So when we are counting carbohydrates, it is always best to train our eye and to make sure we're being as accurate as possible. And the best way to do that is to have a couple tools on hand. So I want to have a calculator, measuring cups, measuring spoons, food scale, and perhaps somewhere to write down some information. Even myself, I work in food, and I'm looking at food all day long, but I still have trouble sometimes estimating how much I'm looking at. So, for example, we are talking about rice. So a third of a cup of rice is 15 grams. If I were to plop a spoonful of rice on my plate, I would not be able to figure out and tell you how much carbohydrate is in that rice without measuring it first. So always best to sort of train your eye and use scales and measuring cups as much as possible. I'll show you an example actually to sort of see how the eye can be a little bit deceiving. So even though you might think you can tell how much you're having, so you might think, oh, that's a cup of cereal I'm having, or that's a cup of rice I'm having, it may turn out to be a lot more. And we want to be as accurate as possible, especially if we're taking insulin based on how much carbs we're having. So in this example, we're looking at a bowl of cereal here, and I'll get everyone to guess how much cereal they think is in this bowl. And then I'll have people guess how much cereal is in the next bowl. And I will admit that I looked at these slides for the first time today, so I too got to do these examples blinded, and I got the wrong answer. I thought it was half a cup and 1 cup, but it turns out it's 1 cup and 2 cups. And really, our bowl size can make a big difference in determining how much it is, because we might think that a full bowl means 1 cup when it's really 2 cups, or half a bowl is only half a cup, but it's really a full cup. So it just goes to show that it is important to measure your foods, especially the first few times. Eventually you will train your eye, and you'll get much better than even me at looking at and determining how much carbs are on your plate. But again, it is a good to even go back and retrain your eye every so often. Sometimes we have people who come in and we're taking a look at their blood sugars, and we're like, things are getting variable. How's that carb counting doing? Maybe you should pull out those measuring cups again and just recheck your eye. So certainly there are times when it's very tricky to estimate. At the restaurant, it may not be fun or cool to pull out your measuring cups at the table. So in that case, you kind of have to use your trained eye or use some estimates. So if we're talking about starches, a fist is probably about a cup of your grains. When you're talking about vegetables, you sort of want 2 cups or 2 handfuls. When it comes to meats, we're looking at a palm, and fats, maybe the tip of our thumb. So we now know where to find the information for carbohydrates. We know which foods contain carbohydrates, and now we can count them. So there's a few different methods. One is the plate method. One is looking at the fixed number of carb choices. The other is using a fixed number of grams of carbohydrates. And the last one is using the insulin to carb ratio to actually vary the insulin based on the amount of carbs. We're going to go through each of those. So the first one is the plate method. And you'll see here we have half of the plate is vegetables or free vegetables. A quarter is our protein. Again, those have no carbs. Then we've got a quarter of our plate, or about 30 grams of carbs in our starchy food. And then we've also got a serving of milk and a serving of fruit. And that there would be 60 grams of carbohydrates, or 4 choices. So in this example, they chose melon for their fruit, and it's about a cup of melon for 15 grams. They've got 3/4 a cup of yogurt for 15 grams, and they've got 1 medium potato all chopped up, which would be, sorry, it's not showing there, but 30 grams. So together we have 60 grams, or 4 choices. But the same configuration could look slightly different on another day. So that could be Monday's dinner, this could be Tuesday's dinner. And in this example, instead of potato, they chose 30 grams of carbohydrate worth of corn, so a cup of corn. They have milk instead of yogurt, and they have 1 pear instead of the cup of melon. So you can still see you've got the 4 choices and the same amount of carbs, but you varied the food on the plate. And again, they also did vary the vegetables and the protein as well. And what you see here is they do have a variety of foods. They've got their vegetables, their proteins, their milk, and their fruit. All right, so in this example, now we've got potato, chicken, and vegetables. So if you look at that, we had our example. We know that our chicken is going to be free. We've got the mashed potatoes, which would be 30 grams. The vegetables, which are free. And that would be 2 choices, or 30 grams. But if we'd like, we could also add a fruit for 1 choice. And if we'd like, we can add a milk, and that would give us 4 choices. And that, again, would give us our 60 grams of carbs. So that's going to be our plate method. So how much carbs should you be aiming for? So if we're talking about setting a fixed amount of carbs for your meal, for women, we're looking at 3 to 4 choices per meal, or about 45 to 60 grams of carbs. For men, it's about 4 to 5 choices, or 60 to 75 grams of carbs. But keep in mind, this will vary depending on your weight goals. So if you're trying to lose weight, maintain, or gain weight, then we might have to vary that a little bit. But these are some guidelines. So we can either have the fixed amount of carbs, where each meal we're going to say, okay, what am I planning to eat today? So which of those foods contain carbs? Then we have to think, okay, what was my goal for this meal. So, okay, my goal was 60 grams of carbs. So then how much of each of those foods that I was planning to eat that contain carbs can I have? Add them up and make sure we meet our goal. Or we can have a flexible amount of carbs. So we just decide what we're going to have, figure out how much carbs is in it, and then we pick the amount of insulin based on what we're eating. So one is really about consistency, and then sort of varying the items within a set amount of carbs. The other one is varying the items and varying the carbs, and then varying the insulin. So it's certainly more flexible. So this might be sort of an example of a meal plan for today. You may say for breakfast, I'm going to have 3 choices or 45 grams of carbs. For lunch, you might say I'm going to have 4 choices or 60 grams of carbs. And dinner, I might have the same, probably 4 choices and 60 grams of carbs. And certainly when you're setting these goals, and you can work with your diabetes team, you want to think about what you're doing now, how much carbs are you eating at each of your meals now, and where do you want to be. And make sure you're filling it in with the other foods, like the vegetables and the meats and alternatives. But then really the key for this one is keeping it consistent. So you've got a budget now for each of your meals. You can vary the items within your budget, but you want to keep the budget consistent. And so we talked about in the plate method too, sort of having a variety of items. So the best is if you can have your carb choices from maybe each of the categories. But certainly sometimes there's going to be times when we're having all of our carb choices from the same category, and it might look something like this. So we may be having pasta and bread for a meal, and that's fine. You can still keep it within your target, and this is a nice once-in-a-while meal. But when at all possible, it's best if we can have a variety of items and make sure we're selecting our carbohydrate foods from all categories. So, for example, we may decide that we're having our 4 choices or 60 grams of carbs at our dinner. So we can look at our starch choices. You might be having 2 starch choices. So your options could be 2/3 of a cup of cooked rice, 1 potato, or 1 cup of pasta. Then for your fruit choice, it could be 2 cups of strawberries, 1 cup of melon, or 2 kiwis. And your milk choice could be either a cup of low-fat milk or 3/4 of a cup of low-fat plain yogurt. So if you think about it as a budget, you can make lots of choices within your budget as long as you stick to your budget. So certainly, one goal may be to get to the point where you're using what's called an insulin to carb ratio to vary your insulin if you're on that rapid-acting insulin based on your carbs. So some people take do what's called MDI, so multiple daily injections. So that's where they're taking a basal insulin as well as a bolus insulin or a mealtime insulin with their carbs. So it's very important with our rapid insulin to match that to the carbs we're eating. And if we want to vary the amount of carbs we're eating, we need to know how much insulin that we need to take for that amount of carbs that we're eating. And certainly when we're doing this method, we want to be exact on our amount of carbs because it is determining how much insulin we're taking. And if we count too little carbs or too much carbs, it's going to cause fluctuations in our blood sugar. All right, so the insulin to carb ratio is a ratio that you can figure out with the help of your diabetes team, and it identifies the amount of rapid-acting insulin needed for a specific amount of carbs. So, for example, one person's ratio may be 1 to 10. So this would mean that for every 10 grams of carbs, 1 unit of rapid-acting insulin is required. And so this allows us to use this ratio to vary our insulin based on that. And this ratio is determined by looking at our blood sugars before and 2 hours after the meal. So here's an example. So a patient has an insulin ratio of 1 to 10, and at their first meal, they're going to have 60 grams of carbs. And so what we need to do is take that 60 grams and divide it by the 10, or the second number in the ratio, and we're going to get 6 units, because we know that 1 unit is good for every 10 grams of carbohydrates. So if we have 60 grams of carbohydrates, we need 6 units. But the good thing is we can be flexible. So for the next meal, if it contains only 39 grams of carbohydrates, then we just divide the 39 by 10, and we get 3.9, which in this case, because it's so close, we'd round it up to 4. And we'd take 4 units for that meal. So you can see how it's nice, because you can decide how much carbs you want to eat and then choose your insulin accordingly. All right, so here's another example for you. So we have 2 slices of bread, and we're saying that the 2 slices of bread are 28 grams of carbs. We have half a banana, which is about 12 grams of carbs, and then we have 1 cup of milk, which is 12 grams of carbs. So we add it up, and we're having 52 grams for the meal. We know that in this example, our insulin to carb ratio is 1 to 10. So I'll give everybody a minute to think about how much insulin we would take for this meal. All right, so we would divide through by 10, and we're going to get 52 divided by 10 is 5.2. So we would round down in that case to 5 units. And one thing I did want to point out here is that maybe looking here at these 2 slices of bread and you see 28 grams, but you're thinking, but you already mentioned that 1 slice of bread is 15 grams of carbohydrates. So we can see that while these exchange systems are helpful, it's hard to capture every type of bread or every type of fruit or milk. So we have to estimate a little bit. So the best information is going to be from the label. So from the label here, we see that for 2 slices of bread, the total carbohydrates is 31, so we have to subtract the 3 grams of fiber, and we see that for the 2 slices, it's actually 28 grams. So we really do want to be as accurate as possible. So if you choose a certain type of bread every day, it might be worth reading the label and figuring out how many available carbs are in your slice of bread versus just using the estimates. There we go. So the amount of insulin we needed was 5 units. All right, so how do we know if our insulin to carb ratio is working? So the best thing we can do is look at our blood sugar before and 2 hours after, and that's going to help us to figure out how our insulin to carb ratio worked. There's one sort of caveat to that, or sort of note to consider, and is if your meal is full of fat and protein, it may take up to 4 hours to look at and figure out your insulin to carb ratio, because while fat and protein don't directly affect our blood sugar, they can slow down how quickly our food turns into sugar. So if we're trying to figure out how our insulin to carb ratio is working, we'd like to keep a record book and log our sugars for different meals. So we want to write down what we ate, and we want to look at our blood sugar. Was it high? Was it low? And then see if we can figure out, was that ratio appropriate, or do we need to make changes? And this is definitely something you want to do with your diabetes team. And it's great if you can have some insight, but they will certainly help you, because it is very tricky, and I'll show you an example. So here's an example of a log we'd have. We've got our insulin dose, our blood sugar before the meal, our meal, the amount of carbs, our 2 hours, our blood sugar 2 hours after, and then if we did any activity. Because as we know, activity can affect our blood sugars. It can make it go up, it can make it go down, and that will sort of interfere with testing our insulin to carb ratio. So here's an example of a logbook. So if we look at breakfast, the blood sugar before the meal was 4.3. 2 hours after is 8.8. So before the meal, we're looking about 4 to 7. 2 hours after the meal, we're looking sort of 5 to 10. Again, that will vary based on your own targets. So this meal looks pretty good. Looks like it worked out pretty well, this insulin to carb ratio. But the patient in this example went biking, so we're not sure if it was the insulin to carb ratio that made sure the blood sugar was in target after, or if it was the activity. So unfortunately, we can't use that one. In the next example, our blood sugar before was 6.9, looks pretty good. Afterwards, it was a little bit high, so we'd know that that ratio didn't work out too well. In the next example, the blood sugar after looks pretty good, but the blood sugar before is a little bit high. So again, we can't really use the ratio for that one. So certainly it is a trial and error process, and it's going to take time working with your team to figure out the ratio that works with you and then fine-tuning that ratio. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about quickly was other sources for information where you can find the amount of carbs in food. So packages certainly have labels, but some foods don't have packages, like fruits and vegetables or certain baked good items or even restaurants. So you can use, there's a link here to the USDA nutrient database, and the link is there, so I'll give people a second to write that down. And then there's also calorieking.com. There are lots of apps like MyFitnessPal, and when you're using MyFitnessPal, just look for the ones that have the green check mark because those ones have been verified. So lots of different sources. There's also books and other websites that can give you the carbohydrate information. All right, and so that's all of the information I had today on my slides, but I'd be happy to answer some questions. So I think Farah will ask me some questions that you've been giving today, and thank you again so much for listening. Being my first webinar, it was really fun for me, and I hope you learned something today.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. You shared with us some really, really great information on carbohydrate counting. I can say I myself have learned a lot, and I'm definitely looking forward to using all the tips and tricks in my daily routine. So just so you know, we've had quite a few questions in our Q&A section. So folks, we're going to try and get through as many as possible today. And for those of you whose questions we don't get to, please feel free to email us at webinars@diabetes.ca, and the CDA will be sure to get back to you. Okay, so without further ado, I'll start off with our first question. One of our participants has asked, does the 15-gram portions include fiber?
Oh, great question. Thank you so much for asking that. So the 15-gram portions already have the fiber subtracted off. So that is the available carbohydrates. So you can use those when you're determining how many carbs you're having. Thank you.
Great. I'll move on to the next one. When you speak about peas as not being a free vegetable, does that include sugar and snap peas or also snow peas?
That is a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not 100% sure on the answer to that question. So maybe if you could email that question and they could answer that for you. I suspect that it's the little pea pods have most of the sugar versus the actual shell, which I think might be more free. So if we're talking about snow peas, I think those would be free. But if we're talking about sort of fresh peas where you pull the peas out of the pod or you get them frozen, that sort of thing, those ones would contain carbs that we'd need to count.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Another participant has asked, when you had mentioned 1/3 cup of rice is 15 grams, for the portion, what kind of rice were you referring to? And was it short grain or long grain rice?
Yeah, so it's in terms of the portion, it's any type of rice, but different types of rice are going to have a different glycemic index. And also brown rice has a bit more fiber, so it may be a little bit less carbohydrates if you're looking at equal amounts, because they're just kind of estimates. So the best would be to look when you're comparing your rices at the label. But in terms of the glycemic index, there's a rice called parboiled rice. So I'm just trying to find my link here. Yeah, sorry, the parboiled converted rice, was the word I'm looking for. And the brown rice, they are slightly lower in the glycemic index, so they're going to turn into sugar more slowly, so they're not going to spike your blood sugar as much at the 2-hour mark, which is great because our body and our insulin, that's either our own insulin or the insulin we take, actually responds better to the foods that turn into sugar a little bit more slowly and are on the low end of the glycemic index.
Great. Thanks for that response, Megan. We have another question here from one of our participants. They're asking, with regards to gluten-free options, is the measurement for pasta and bread still the same?
So we didn't specifically look at those. For pasta, I think you'd be close. The thing with the gluten-free bread is that the slices are often different sizes. And some of them are really dense, where some of them are really fluffy. So for those things, I would definitely use your label. And what I recommend is, especially if you are celiac or gluten intolerant, or if you choose any specialty product, if you're eating these products on a daily basis, I recommend making your own sort of cheat sheet or choices guide that has your items. So, for example, instead of having to look at the label for your bread every time, if you write down that 2 slices of your gluten-free bread is 13 grams of carbohydrates, then you're going to be able to go to that quickly each time.
Okay, great. We'll move on to the next question. Do you have any, or are you rather aware of the total carb guidelines for children?
Unfortunately, I am not. I work with an adult population, so I'm not as aware. But you certainly could refer to Canada's Food Guide. They do have grains and fruits and milk serving recommendations for children. And certainly, as with adults, but certainly with children, we do want to make sure that they're getting a variety of carb options, so that would be really important.
Okay, we have another participant here who's asked, do you have a suggestion for some pre-made foods when the serving information is not available? For example, lentils, quinoa, a salad mixture, casseroles. So they're prepared, but the serving information is not included.
So it's definitely very tricky if they don't already have a label. So one thing you can do is some websites and apps will have sort of an estimate, which might be useful. And then if you sort of you can sort of pick similar items. So certainly that's why eating out and having prepared foods that don't have food labels can get tricky, and hopefully more of our food items will have labels. The other option is if you are making these meals yourself, then it's nice to sort of figure out, take your recipe, figure out the amount of carbs and how many portions it makes for you, and then figure out the carbs for your portion. But unfortunately, it is very tricky when it comes to pre-prepared foods. You kind of got to use your own trained eye and say, oh, that looks like it's got about half a cup of quinoa, and that's the main carbohydrate there. So I'm going to go ahead and assume it's this many carbohydrates.
Okay, we'll move on to the next participant. Thanks for that response, Megan. The next participant has asked, how can tofu, beans, and etc. have little or no carbs when they have carbs on the label and even subtracting the fiber isn't significant?
Yeah, so when it comes to beans and chickpeas and lentils, you're definitely going to have to count the carbs in those ones. But they do count as a carb and a protein. So certainly for vegetarians, they're going to be a main source of protein. So about half a cup of your legumes is going to be one choice, or 15 grams. When it comes to tofu, sometimes items that have sort of 5 grams of carbs or less, once we subtract off the fiber, we still count as free. But certainly if you are using your insulin to carb ratio, you are going to want to count those. So they may not necessarily be completely free items. So that's definitely a good point.
Okay, great. Our next participant has said that mixing milk and meat is against their religion. Do you have any substitutions for them? Something else, I guess, they can drink with their meal?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. You don't necessarily have to have all the items in one meal. If you want to, you can, like, I certainly want your religious sort of tenets would be most important. So if having mixing milk and meat is not appropriate, then certainly by all means have your milk at another time. You just want to make sure you're getting all of the nutrients like the calcium, vitamin D, they're in the milk. But again, there are certainly people who don't drink milk as well, so it could be other substitutes like soy beverages, which are certainly appropriate as well. These, again, are just guidelines, and as long as you're sticking to your carb goals and you're getting a variety of foods throughout your day, you can certainly combine them in most any way possible.
Okay, great. So we're just going to take a few more questions here before we close off. A few folks actually have asked about cheese and how that fits into everything, seeing as how it's made from milk.
Yeah, so in cheese, the process of making the cheese, it's actually the whey that contains most of the carbohydrates. So most of the carbohydrates do get removed, and then they use the curds to actually make the cheese. And so the cheese is usually quite low in carbohydrates.
Okay, great. One of our participants has asked, is ground flax, would you suggest putting ground flax on cereal as a good source of fiber?
Yeah, so absolutely. If you like ground flax, that is a good source of fiber. It depends what type of fiber you're looking for. So there's two types of fiber. There's soluble fiber and there's insoluble fiber. If you keep the seeds together, that's going to be an insoluble fiber, so it's going to go right through you and it's going to help you stay regular. So that might be one benefit of that. If you grind it, you're going to get more of the soluble fiber out, and that has lots of benefits. It's a nice slow, it gels up and kind of helps to slow down the absorption of sugars. It can help with cholesterol, and flax certainly has lots of health benefits.
Okay, great. We're just going to take two more questions here. One of our participants have asked, do we use the carb count for a between meal snack?
Yeah, absolutely. Carbs in snacks are going to affect our sugars. So if, for example, you take oral agents to control your diabetes or something like a basal insulin, the carbs in your snacks are going to affect your blood sugar. So you want to make sure you're not having large carb snacks. So you might set a goal, for example, of like 15 grams or at most maybe 30 grams of carbs in your snack, depending on what works for you. And then patients on MDI, especially pump patients, they're often taking boluses or rapid-acting insulin for their snacks as well to account for the sugar in their carbs. The carbs in their snacks.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So again, folks, for those of you whose questions we didn't get answered, please email us at webinars@diabetes.ca. Just a few things before we close off. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a resource list there. Please feel free to download that resource. It's a resource created on carb counting, so it'll go over some of the things that we went over today. It'll be a great reminder for you guys, the kind of how-tos. So I do encourage you to do that. I did want to say thank you to everyone who attended the webinar today, and we hope you learned as much as I did, and to all our volunteers who helped coordinate this session. We'd also like to thank you to our generous sponsors who made this presentation possible, to Bayer and to Merck. Now, this is the first webinar of our fall series, so we do hope that you'll participate in our upcoming webinar sessions. So again, we'll be having one session per week going until mid-October. So check us out at diabetes.ca/webinars and register for hopefully all of them. If you are interested in a virtual health coaching program that we do offer at CDA, it's a really great program to goal set and keep you motivated to reach your goals. Please call us at 1-800-BANTING. We do have some really great CDA expos going on all across the country. So please visit our website at diabetes.ca/expos, or you can give us a call at 1-800-BANTING. And to sign and be a part of the Diabetes Charter, please visit diabetes.ca/charter. So once again, I just want to thank all of you for attending. We hope you enjoyed it, and we do look forward to your participation next week. Have a great day. Thank you.